The Maltese Falcon movie review. So I just finished watching The Big Sleep, which is a classic hard-boiled detective movie from the 1940s with Humphrey Bogart, and loved it. And I thought to myself, why have I waited this long in life to watch these classic hard-boiled 1940s detective movies? I mean, everybody knows about them. They're parodied all the time. I've always kind of been vaguely interested in them, but just never got around to watching them. So I went straight back to the video store and got the Maltese Falcon. Now, the Maltese Falcon has a lot of similarities with The Big Sleep. They're both kind of classic movies, 1940s. They're both, I guess the genre would be hard-boiled detective movies. Both of them star Humphrey Bogart. Both of them take place in California, for whatever that's worth. Now, there are some differences as well. Big Sleep was based on Raymond Chandler, who's kind of looked upon as the genius of the hard-boiled detective novels. The Maltese Falcon is based on the Sam Spade books by a guy named Philip Marlowe, who I've got to admit I've not read, although I've read about him, and I think the consensus is that he was good, but not as good as Raymond Chandler. I don't know, let me know. Also, The Big Sleep had the great William Faulkner working on it, and Leigh Brackett. Maltese Falcon doesn't quite have that same prestige with its screenwriters. And perhaps because of this, the dialogue is not nearly as good as The Big Sleep. But that is to kind of put the weakest foot forward. It's a very enjoyable movie. And I think, at least in terms of story and plotting, I enjoyed The Maltese Falcon more. Now, The Maltese Falcon, it turns out, the premise of the story is there's a legend of Knights Templars who have like this, which is the legend of the Maltese Falcon. So it's interesting. I saw this movie kind of shortly after the Da Vinci Code came out, when kind of everyone was taking a renewed interest in the legend of the Knights Templars and all this kind of stuff. Interesting that this kind of stuff is not new. I mean, obviously the Knights Templars are not new, but like the interest in this stuff kind of goes in and out of fashion. People are writing stories about like the lost treasures of the Knights Templars way back in the 1940s. So several different people are interested in recovering the lost Templar treasure of the Maltese Falcon. There are several different characters with conflicting motives, and there's lots of betrayals and changing alliances. It requires a certain amount of close attention to keep track of everything, but if you watch closely, everything makes perfect sense in the end. Or at least, if there are plot holes, I didn't catch them. Let me know if I missed something. Minor spoilers, there are a couple of shockers at the end. One of them I actually saw coming from a long way away. One of them took me completely by surprise. Both of them make perfect sense once you think about it. Or again, disclaimer, if there was a plot hole, I didn't catch it. It seemed to make sense to me. This is a classic film, and yeah, the lighting and cinematography are just superb in this film. Like, you can tell why it's regarded as a classic. Although with a movie like this, I'm reluctant to praise it up too much as like a classic film with great cinematography, because it's also just a fun, pulpy film to watch, a great kind of detective movie. So to kind of praise it as a classic film kind of takes away from the fun of it. I think this is one of those great films that just happens to be a classic. It has a very modern feel to it. I think even though it's really old, it can hold its own against kind of any modern detective movie in terms of like if you were to sit people down in front of the TV today. There's as much to hook them in the Maltese Falcon as any modern film. And the cast. So I already said it had Humphrey Bogart in it, but it's got a couple of other notable actors. It's got Peter, I think I'm pronouncing this right, Lorre, L-O-R-R-E, who's a great Austrian-Hungarian actor. If you don't know who he is, you're probably familiar with parodies of him. He's an Austrian-Hungarian actor. He was in Casablanca. He was in this. He was in a bunch of old movies. He's got kind of a creepy looking face and speaks with a bit of an accent because he was from Austria and Hungary. And he was parodied in a lot of cartoons, like kind of Ren and Stimpy is kind of like a parody of his voice. I'm not going to attempt to do an imitation of him just because I'm terrible about it, but like Google him. You'll recognize him, or you'll recognize the stereotype of him as soon as you see it. So he was in this movie. He was also in Casablanca. Casablanca is one of my favorite movies of all time. And yeah, maybe one of these days I'll do a review of Casablanca, not today. But interestingly enough, Sidney Greenstreet, who was also in Casablanca, is in this movie. In fact, according to Wikipedia, The Maltese Falcon was Sidney Greenstreet's film debut, and then he did Casablanca afterwards. But if you're interested in this stuff, Humphrey Bogart, Peter Lorre, and Sidney Greenstreet are all in this film, and then all three of them are also in Casablanca. So there's a lot of kind of overlap between the casts of these classic films. But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Anyways, I highly recommend this film, so check it out if you get the chance.